I stood outside the dining room window of my parents' suburban Atlanta mansion, clutching a $5,000 diamond bracelet for Mother's Day, when I heard the clink of crystal glasses. Thank God Aaliyah did not show up. My brother Malik laughed. She completely ruins the aesthetic of a luxury party. His wife Megan agreed my dark skin and thrift store clothes embarrassed her guests. My mother Bernice called me an ugly girl, but a walking ATM, which was all they needed. I did not shed a single tear. I simply dropped the velvet box into the trash bin, pulled out my phone, and called my lawyer to execute a plan that would leave them all homeless. I knew right then that I would never allow them to disrespect me again. The pain of their betrayal fueled a burning desire for absolute justice. I was completely ready to claim my power today. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to destroy the people who took your love for granted. My name is Aaliyah, and I am 34 years old. To my family, I am just a low-level financial worker who lives in Chicago and sends home a portion of my meager salary out of guilt. What they do not know is that I am a senior investment strategist for one of the largest wealth management firms in the country. I make 7 figures a year and have a real estate portfolio stretching across 3 states. Growing up in a household ruled by a narcissistic mother and an enabling father meant any achievement I had was diminished. My mother Bernice was obsessed with appearances and status. She worshipped my younger brother Malik, who was born with lighter skin and a charming smile. Malik was the golden child who could do no wrong even when he was gambling away his tuition money. I was the dark-skinned scapegoat, constantly reminded that I needed to work twice as hard because I lacked my brother's natural advantages. When Malik married Megan, a white woman from a wealthy background, my mother treated it like a royal wedding. Megan was arrogant and condescending, constantly delivering passive-aggressive insults about my natural hair or my simple clothes. I drove an 8-year-old SUV and wore unbranded clothing whenever I visited them in Atlanta, simply to avoid their endless demands for money. Despite their toxic behavior, I still fulfilled my duty as a daughter. When they faced foreclosure 3 years ago, I quietly bought their sprawling mansion through a blind trust. They had no idea they were living in my house rent-free. This Mother's Day, I decided to make an effort. I had been in therapy for 2 years, processing my childhood trauma, and genuinely wanted to see if our relationship could improve. I flew into Atlanta, rented a modest car, and drove to the suburban estate. I bought a custom diamond tennis bracelet for my mother and a massive bouquet of imported orchids. The driveway was packed with luxury cars, including Malik's new Range Rover and Megan's Porsche. They were hosting an upscale brunch for Megan's wealthy friends and my parents' high society church members. I walked up the stone pathway toward the front door. The large bay windows of the formal dining room were opened slightly to let in the spring breeze. As I reached for the doorbell, I heard Malik speaking loudly over the chatter of the guests. Malik announced that they should raise a glass to the best Mother's Day gift of all. He said thank God Aaliyah decided not to show up today because she always makes these high-end gatherings feel so depressing. I froze in my tracks, stepping closer to the window, concealing myself behind a large rosebush to listen. Megan let out a high-pitched laugh, telling Malik he was right. She said she was terrified I would show up in one of my awful thrift store outfits with my hair all wild, because she did not want her important investors thinking they associated with the help. Several people chuckled. I waited for my father, Leroy, to tell Megan to respect his daughter, but he just chuckled along with them. He told Malik not to be too hard on me, because I try my best even if I am rough around the edges. Then my mother Bernice spoke up, cutting through the laughter with her sharp, authoritative tone. She stated that I was not a pretty girl and that I lacked class. But she added that I work hard at my little desk job and send home checks whenever Malik needs a boost. She called me a walking ATM for the family, saying that as long as I keep funding Malik's lifestyle, I can be as ugly and socially awkward as I want, just as long as I stay in Chicago and do not ruin their aesthetic today. The clinking of crystal glasses echoed through the open window as my entire family toasted to my absence and my ugliness. A cold, absolute clarity washed over me. For 34 years, I had bent over backwards to earn the love of people who saw me as nothing more than an ugly bank account. I looked down at the velvet box in my hand, meant for a woman who despised me. I did not shed a single tear. The wounded little girl inside me died right there on the front porch, and a ruthless businesswoman took her place. I walked over to the outdoor trash bin and dropped the velvet box and the orchids inside. Then I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. I told Attorney Davis to execute Plan B immediately. I hung up the phone, took a deep breath, and pushed the heavy oak front door wide open. The heavy oak door swung open with a slow, deliberate creak that echoed through the grand foyer. I stepped onto the polished marble floor and walked directly toward the dining room where the laughter was still ringing. As I crossed the threshold, the entire room froze. It was as if someone had hit pause on a movie. Malik stood at the head of the table, his crystal glass still suspended in midair. My mother's wide smile instantly contorted into an expression of sheer panic before melting into a mask of forced delight. My father, Leroy, dropped his gaze to the tablecloth, suddenly finding the floral arrangements deeply fascinating. The silence in the room was deafening. Even the affluent guests from my mother's church and Megan's social circle seemed to sense the sudden drop in temperature. Then the performance began. Aaliyah, my darling. Bernice practically sang, rushing forward with arms wide open. We thought you were not coming. What a wonderful surprise. She pulled me into an embrace that felt as hollow as her words. I let her hug me, keeping my arms loosely at my sides, breathing in the overwhelming scent of her expensive perfume. I decided to make the drive after all, I said, my voice perfectly even. I would not want to miss celebrating you on Mother's Day. I looked directly at Malik, who quickly lowered his glass and pasted on a wide, nervous grin. Big sister, you made it, he announced, stepping forward to give me a firm pat on the shoulder. We were just talking about you. I know, I replied, holding his gaze a second longer than necessary. I heard you. Malik swallowed hard, but his arrogance quickly returned. He always assumed he could charm his way out of any situation. Megan sauntered over, adjusting her designer dress. She looked me up and down, taking in my unbranded jeans and simple cotton blouse. Her eyes lingered on my natural hair, which I wore in a full, thick afro. She took a sip of her champagne and gave me a patronizing smile. Aaliyah, she purred. It is so brave of you to just show up like this. I mean, most people would want to dress up a little for such a formal gathering. And your hair, it is so big and ethnic. I could never pull off something so unkempt. It must be so freeing to just not care about how you look around important company. The room went dead silent again. A few of Megan's white friends exchanged uncomfortable glances. My mother looked horrified, not because of the insult, but because she feared I would make a scene and ruin her elegant brunch. My father stared intently at his shoes. I did not shrink. I did not apologize. I simply smiled, a slow, calculated smile that made Megan's smug expression falter. It is incredibly freeing, Megan. I said, my tone conversational but sharp as glass. Almost as freeing as not having to rely on someone else's credit card to buy a personality. I tilted my head, studying her. Your hair looks lovely, by the way. Did you use the same salon that bleached your roots? Or just the same filter you used to hide the debt on your social media? Megan's mouth fell open. A soft gasp rippled through the guests. I took a step closer to her, lowering my voice, just enough so only the family and the nearest guests could hear. Natural hair requires strong roots, Megan. Something that thrives without synthetic enhancements or fake validation. You should try it sometime, though. I suppose some things just cannot be bought. Megan turned a splotchy shade of red, clutching her champagne flute so tightly her knuckles turned white. She looked at Malik for backup, but my brother was too busy staring at me in shock. The old Aaliyah, the sister who used to bite her tongue and swallow her tears, would have never spoken to her like that. The old Aaliyah would have apologized and tried to make herself smaller, but that woman was gone, left behind on the front porch with the trash. The tension in the dining room was so thick it was suffocating. The wealthy guests started shifting uncomfortably, looking at their watches and murmuring to each other. My mother realized her perfect aesthetic was collapsing rapidly. She clapped her hands together, producing a high-pitched, forced laugh that sounded like breaking glass. Well, now, Bernice chirped, her eyes darting nervously around the room. We are just so thrilled to have our whole family together. Aaliyah, honey, you must be exhausted from the drive. Why do you not come into the private den and sit down? I have been telling all my friends about my hard-working daughter in Chicago. I did not break eye contact with Megan as I answered. Lead the way, mother. Bernice ushered me away from the guests, guiding me toward the private family den at the back of the house. As I walked past the grand staircase, I noticed the new crystal chandelier my mother had recently installed. It was a lavish purchase meant to impress her church friends, all funded by the illusion of wealth my brother supposedly provided. The irony was not lost on me. I owned the very floorboards they were standing on, yet they treated me like a trespasser in my own fortress. Leroy and Malik followed closely behind, with Megan trailing them, her face still flushed with humiliation. As we entered the den, the lavish sounds of the party faded away. The heavy mahogany doors muffled the classical music playing in the courtyard. This room was where my father supposedly handled his business, though we all knew it was just a place for him to hide from my mother's demands. I stood in the center of the plush Persian rug, waiting. The fake smiles vanished from their faces the moment we were out of sight from their precious guests. Bernice dropped the loving mother act instantly. Her posture stiffened and her eyes narrowed as she looked at my plain clothes. She took a deep breath, smoothing the front of her expensive silk dress, and forced one last tight smile onto her face. "So glad you are here, Aaliyah," she said, her voice dropping its musical lilt and taking on a serious, demanding tone. "We actually have some family business we need your help with." Behind me, I heard the distinct metallic click of a heavy lock sliding into place. I turned my head slightly. Malik had quietly deadbolted the heavy den doors, shutting us in completely. The heavy click of the deadbolt echoed in the quiet room. I did not flinch. I did not turn around to demand why my own brother felt the need to lock me inside my father's den. Instead, I walked slowly toward the center of the room and took a seat in the oversized leather armchair, crossing my legs with deliberate calm. I looked at the four of them standing there like a firing squad. So I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady, "What is this urgent family business that requires a hostage situation?" Bernice took a seat on the velvet sofa across from me, while Leroy remained standing by the fireplace, his arms crossed over his chest. Malik paced the floor for a moment before stopping right in front of my chair. He flashed that signature golden child smile that usually got him whatever he wanted. The smile that had charmed his way out of every consequence since childhood. "Aaliyah, you know I am always working on my next big move," he began, his voice dripping with forced enthusiasm. "I have a massive opportunity, a crypto investment firm. The returns are guaranteed and I have already secured the initial clients. I just need a little seed money to get the server infrastructure running. $50,000. That is it. Just a drop in the bucket for a big city girl like you." I stared at him. $50,000. He asked for it as if he were asking to borrow $20 for lunch. I let the silence stretch, letting his smile slowly fade into a nervous twitch. "A crypto investment firm." I repeated, my tone completely flat. "Is that what we are calling it these days, Malik? Because 2 years ago it was a boutique logistics company. Do you remember that one?" Malik's face tightened. "That was different," he muttered, looking away, unable to meet my eyes. "The market shifted. It was out of my control." "The market did not shift, Malik," I said, leaning forward slightly, resting my hands on my knees. "My $200,000 investment shifted. It shifted directly from your business account into offshore sports betting platforms and underground poker games. I worked 80-hour weeks negotiating corporate mergers to build my wealth, and you blew $200,000 of my hard-earned money in 4 months to feed your gambling addiction. And mother and father covered for you. They lied to my face and told me your warehouses had flooded." "Do not bring up the past," Bernice snapped, her voice rising as she gripped the armrest of the sofa. Her manicured nails dug into the fabric. Your brother made a mistake. He is a young man learning the ropes of the business world. You have a good job in Chicago. You recovered the money easily. You should be lifting your brother up instead of tearing him down with ancient history. That is what families do, Aaliyah. They protect each other. I turned my cold gaze to my mother. Stealing $250,000 is not a mistake, Mother. It is a crime. And I only let it go back then because I pitied him, because I thought he would get help. But my charity ends today. I will not give you $50,000, Malik. I will not give you 50 cents. Leroy finally stepped away from the fireplace, his face dark with anger. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at me. You listen to me, Aaliyah. You are acting like a selfish, spoiled brat. This family gave you everything. We put clothes on your back and food in your mouth. Your brother is on the verge of something great, and you are going to sit there and hoard your money while your own flesh and blood struggles. You are a disgrace to this family name. I looked at my father, the man who had always let my mother dictate my worth. You put clothes on my back because that is the basic legal requirement of a parent. Leroy, I said, dropping the title of dad entirely. The disrespect made him take a step back in shock. And let us not pretend you funded my life. I started working at a diner when I was 16 just to pay for my own school supplies because all your extra cash went to Malik's designer sneakers and elite sports camps. I am not selfish for protecting my own wealth. You are selfish for demanding it. Malik slammed his hand down on the mahogany desk, rattling the expensive crystal decanter resting on top. You owe me, Aaliyah, he shouted, his charming facade completely gone, replaced by the desperate rage of an addict cornered by his own debts. I need this money. The people I am working with do not play around. If I do not get this funding, they are going to come after me. I have creditors breathing down my neck. You have to help me. Your debts are your own problem, I replied, standing up from the leather chair and smoothing the front of my simple blouse. And locking me in a room will not magically make a checkbook appear. Now unlock the door before I walk out of here and cut you all off for good. I took a step toward the heavy oak doors, but Megan suddenly blocked my path. She had been standing quietly near the bookshelves, her arms crossed and a smug expression playing on her face. Her designer perfume was suffocating in the closed room. The audacity of this white woman standing in my family home, trying to dictate how I handled the money I bled for, was almost comical. There is no need to be so hostile, Aaliyah, Megan purred, stepping into my personal space with unearned confidence. We understand that you might not have $50,000 in liquid cash just sitting in your checking account. We know you are just a standard employee trying to make ends meet in a big city. It is hard out there for a single woman. She walked over to the desk, picked up a manila folder, and slid a thick legal document across the coffee table. It landed right in front of me with a soft thud. If you do not have the cash on hand, we have a very simple solution, Megan said, a wicked smile spreading across her pale face. We had our family attorney draft this up yesterday. Since you travel so much and are always so busy, it just makes sense to keep family assets protected. Just sign this power of attorney, Aaliyah. It gives Malik temporary rights to manage your financial accounts and leverage your credit profile for his business loan. You will not have to lift a finger or spend a dime of your own cash today. Just sign the power of attorney and we will handle the rest. I stared at the thick stack of papers resting on the mahogany coffee table. The words power of attorney echoed in my mind. Megan stood there with that unbearable smirk, acting as if she had just offered me a tremendous favor. I slowly reached out and picked up the document. The paper was heavy and crisp. I did not just glance at the signature line like they probably expected me to. I am a senior investment strategist. My entire career is built on reading the fine print that other people ignore. I flipped past the cover page and began to read the actual clauses. The legal jargon was dense, but its meaning was crystal clear. This was not a limited agreement to help secure a small business loan. This document granted sweeping, unconditional authority over my entire financial portfolio. It included clauses that would allow Malik to take out lines of credit in my name, It gave him the power to liquidate retirement accounts. And most terrifyingly, it granted him the explicit right to encumber real property. He wanted the legal authority to take out a mortgage against any real estate assets I owned. They did not just want $50,000, they wanted a blank check to strip mine my entire life. I kept my eyes on the pages, but my peripheral vision caught a flash of light. Malik shifted his weight impatiently, crossing his arms over his chest. As his suit jacket sleeve pulled back, the heavy gold face of a watch caught the light from the desk lamp. A Rolex Daytona. I know luxury timepieces because my colleagues in Chicago collect them. That specific model costs upwards of $35,000 and is nearly impossible to get without a long purchase history. My gaze drifted over to Megan. She was shifting her weight from foot to foot, looking annoyed that I was actually reading the document. She reached into her handbag to pull out her phone. The bag was a pristine leather tote with distinct hardware and a padlock, a Hermes Birkin. Another item that requires tens of thousands of dollars and an established relationship with a luxury boutique just to be offered the chance to buy it. I lowered the document slightly. Malik has creditors breathing down his neck threatening to come after him, but he is wearing a brand new Rolex Daytona. Megan just complained about how hard it is to make ends meet, but she is carrying a Birkin bag that costs more than most people's cars. A cold, sickening realization washed over me. Neither of them had held down a steady job in years. My parents were supposedly struggling to keep up with the neighborhood aesthetic. Yet here they were dripping in quiet luxury, while demanding I hand over the keys to my financial kingdom. "Nice watch, Malik," I said, my voice soft, but slicing through the heavy silence of the room. "Did the crypto market shift in your favor just long enough for you to visit the jeweler before your creditors found you?" Malik quickly dropped his arms, letting his sleeve fall over his wrist. He looked like a deer caught in headlights. "It is a replica," he stammered, his charming facade crumbling entirely. "Just a prop for business meetings. You have to look successful to attract investors, Aaliyah. You know how it is." I turned my eyes to his wife. "And your bag, Megan. Is that a prop too? Did you buy a fake Birkin to impress the ladies at my mother's church, or are you two bleeding someone else dry?" Megan's pale face flushed a deep, angry red. She pulled the bag closer to her body, clutching the handles defensively. "You do not know anything about our lives," she snapped. "We make investments. We know how to leverage our assets." "Leverage whose assets?" "Megan," I asked, stepping toward her. "Because looking at this contract, you are trying to leverage mine. This is not a cosigner agreement. This gives Malik the right to take out a second mortgage on real estate in my name. You thought because I wear plain clothes and drive an old car that I am too stupid to read a legal contract. You thought you could lock me in a room, bully me with my father's temper, and trick me into handing over my entire net worth so you can keep playing dress-up." Bernice gasped, clutching her chest as if I had physically struck her. Leroy stepped forward, his face purple with rage. "How dare you speak to your brother and his wife like that? They are trying to build a future for this family, and you are interrogating them over accessories. You are paranoid and selfish, Aaliyah. Just sign the papers and stop this foolishness." I looked at my father, then at my mother, then at the brother who had been perfectly willing to ruin my life to save his own skin. I held the power of attorney document up in the air, holding it by the very corner. "I am not signing anything," I said. I let go of the paper. The thick stack of documents fluttered through the air and landed on the floor near Megan's expensive heels. The rejection was absolute. I was not shouting or crying. I was simply denying them the one thing they needed to survive. The polite, condescending mask Megan had been wearing completely shattered. Her features twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She let out a frustrated scream, abandoning the sweet sister-in-law act entirely. She dug her hand deep into her designer bag and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. She stepped forward and threw it directly at my chest. It bounced off me and fluttered to the ground next to the unsigned contract. "Fine." Megan spat, her voice shrill and echoing off the mahogany walls. "If you are going to be a selfish, hoarding witch, Then you can at least make yourself useful today. That is the catering bill for the brunch outside. $25,000. Since you refuse to help your own flesh and blood build a business, you can pay for the food your family is serving. Pay the bill right now, Aaliyah. Stop being such a pathetic freeloader and pay the $25,000. I looked down at the crumpled receipt near my feet. $25,000 for a single afternoon of showing off to people who did not even genuinely like them. Megan did not wait for me to pick it up. She reached behind the heavy leather armchair and pulled out a sleek mobile point-of-sale terminal. The caterers had left it with her to settle the final balance before they packed up the carving stations outside. She shoved the digital screen toward my face, tapping the glass aggressively. The bright white numbers glared at me like a threat. "If you are so successful and so smart," Megan taunted, her voice dripping with venom, "then pay the bill. Prove that you are not just a broke, bitter spinster jealous of your brother's perfect life. Go ahead, Aaliyah, swipe your card. Let us see this massive wealth you keep talking about." Bernice crossed her arms, nodding in agreement. She told me to put my money where my mouth was. Leroy muttered that I was all talk, just like I had always been since I was a little girl. I looked at the four of them standing together, united in their arrogance and their desperate need to tear me down to make themselves feel bigger. I did not argue. I did not defend my bank accounts. I simply reached into my plain leather wallet and pulled out a heavy matte black metal card. It was an invitation-only account reserved for high-net-worth clients, but to my family, it was just a piece of dark plastic. Megan snatched the card from my fingers before I could even hand it to her. She swiped it through the terminal with a dramatic flourish, her eyes locked on mine, waiting for me to panic. The machine displayed a loading circle. It processed for 3 tense seconds. Then a loud, obnoxious beep pierced the silence of the den. The screen flashed bright red with a single word in bold letters. Declined. The room erupted. Megan threw her head back and let out a shrill, triumphant laugh. She shoved the terminal back toward me, pointing at the red screen as if she had just won the lottery. Declined, she shrieked, her voice echoing off the mahogany walls. It was declined. You cannot even clear $25,000 on your credit limit. You are completely broke. Malik doubled over, slapping his knee as he laughed. He told me I was pathetic. He said I came in here acting like I owned the place, acting like I was some Wall Street billionaire, and my card declined at a family brunch. He called me a fraud. He said I was probably drowning in debt in Chicago, playing dress-up while living paycheck to paycheck in a tiny apartment. Bernice shook her head, her face twisted into a mask of pure disgust. She said she was embarrassed to call me her daughter. She told Leroy that I was a complete failure who could not even afford to buy my own family a meal. She said I was a liar who tried to ruin her perfect Mother's Day with my ugly jealousy. Leroy just glared at me, telling me I was a disgrace and that I needed to get out of his house before I humiliated them any further. They were feeding off each other, tearing into me with a vicious hunger. They felt victorious. They thought they had exposed me as an imposter. I just stood there in the center of the room. I did not reach for the machine. I did not ask to run the card again. I did not try to explain that a bank protocol requires vocal authorization for unusual high-value transactions outside of my primary residence state to prevent fraud. I did not tell them any of that. I just smiled. It was not a defensive smile or a polite smile. It was a cold, patient smile. The kind of smile a predator gives when the trap finally snaps shut on its prey. My silence unnerved them. Malik's laughter began to die down, fading into a confused chuckle. Megan frowned, confused by my complete lack of humiliation. She opened her mouth to hurl another insult, to twist the knife deeper, but before she could speak, the quiet den was interrupted by a sharp, buzzing sound. Malik's phone vibrated violently in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen with irritation. Then his expression froze. Before he could process whatever he was reading, Megan's phone chimed loudly from inside her Birkin bag. Then it chimed again, and again, a rapid-fire sequence of alerts echoing through the room like disaster sirens. Megan quickly dug into her bag and pulled out her device. Her eyes darted across the screen. Her jaw dropped. She tapped the screen frantically, refreshing her banking app over and over. Malik was doing the same, his thumb swiping desperately as his breathing grew fast and shallow. "What is it?" Bernice asked, stepping forward, her triumphant mood suddenly replaced by creeping anxiety. "Malik, what is wrong with your phone?" Malik looked up from his screen. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. His eyes were wide with sheer terror. He looked at Megan, who was staring at her phone with her mouth open, unable to form a single word. Then Malik turned his eyes to me. The arrogance was gone. The golden child superiority was gone. "My accounts are locked," he whispered, his voice trembling so badly he could barely get the words out. "All of them. My credit cards, my checking, my savings. Everything is frozen. The bank says there is a massive fraud hold." Megan finally found her voice, though it cracked with pure panic. "Mine too," she gasped. "Every single card is suspended. We have zero available credit." Malik took a slow, terrified step toward me. He held up his phone, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He looked at my calm, smiling face, and the realization hit him like a physical blow. "What the hell did you just do?" I looked at my brother and let out a soft breath. "I did exactly what any responsible account holder does when they detect unauthorized activity, Malik," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet room. "I reported massive systemic fraud to the federal banking authorities." Bernice stumbled forward, her hand clutching her pearl necklace. "Fraud?" she gasped, looking from me to Malik. "What are you talking about, Aaliyah? We did not commit any fraud. We are your family." I turned my attention to my mother, watching the panic slowly replace the Botox stiffness of her face. "2 years ago, Mother, you called me crying," I began. "You told me your heart condition was worsening and that Leroy was struggling to keep up with the medical bills. You said you needed to see out-of-network specialists and buy expensive imported medications. You begged me for help because you said your insurance was tapped out and you were afraid you were going to die." Bernice swallowed hard, taking a step back toward the sofa. I did not blink. I kept my eyes locked on hers. "So I gave you a card," I continued. "An exclusive high-yield credit line meant entirely for your medical expenses. I told you to use it for whatever you needed to stay healthy. I paid the balance in full every single month without ever looking at the itemized statements because I trusted my mother. I thought I was keeping you alive." I slowly shifted my gaze to Megan, who was now shaking so badly her expensive heels were wobbling on the carpet. "But last night I finally looked at those statements, Megan," I said, my tone dropping to a dangerous calm. "And it is absolutely fascinating what kind of medical treatments my mother has been receiving. Apparently her heart condition requires a $35,000 Rolex Daytona. It requires a $20,000 Hermes Birkin bag. It requires first-class flights to Miami and $5,000 weekend tabs at luxury steakhouses." Malik looked like he was going to be sick. He looked down at his wrist, trying to cover the gold watch with his sleeve again, but it was far too late. "You gave my medical emergency card to your golden child," I said, addressing my mother again. "You let Malik and his arrogant wife use my hard-earned money to fund their fake luxury lifestyle. You let them play pretend on my dime while I worked 80-hour weeks in Chicago thinking I was saving your life. We are family." Bernice screamed, her voice cracking as her perfect aesthetic completely shattered. She pointed a trembling finger at me. "I am your mother. I gave you life. I carried you for 9 months and tore my body apart to bring you into this world. Your money is my money, Aaliyah. It all belongs to this family." Malik needed to look the part to get his business off the ground. "He is a man building a legacy. I had every right to redistribute that wealth to help your brother succeed. You do not have the right to commit federal identity theft." "Mother," I replied, stepping closer to her. "Because that is exactly what I reported to the bank this morning. I flagged over $200,000 in unauthorized luxury purchases over the last 24 months. When you report identity theft of that magnitude, the banks do not just cancel the card. They freeze every single financial asset linked to the merchants and the individuals who benefited from the stolen funds. They flagged your accounts, Malik. They flagged your business loans, Megan. Your entire financial existence is currently locked down by federal investigators. Megan let out a loud, terrifying sob. She dropped her Birkin bag on the floor and grabbed Malik's arm, digging her nails into his expensive suit jacket. Malik, you have to fix this, she shrieked, her voice pitching into absolute hysteria. They are going to audit the business accounts. If they see where the money came from, we are going to lose everything. We could go to federal prison, Malik. Malik shoved her off him, his eyes wild with desperation. Shut up, Megan, he hissed before turning back to me. Aaliyah, you have to call the bank right now. You have to tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you authorized those purchases as a gift. If you do not call them right now, they are going to ruin my life. Your life was already ruined. Malik, I said, crossing my arms. You just used my money to buy a prettier facade. I am not calling anyone. The investigation is out of my hands now. Leroy slammed his fist against the mahogany desk, making the entire room jump. That is enough! He roared, marching toward me with his chest puffed out, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. You listen to me, you disrespectful little brat. You are going to pick up your phone, and you are going to clear this mess up right this second. You do not come into my house and threaten your mother and your brother. You do not disrespect this family. I did not back down. I looked my father dead in the eye, completely unfazed by his temper. If you do not fix this right now, Leroy threatened, his face inches from mine, then you are no longer a daughter of mine. I will disown you, Aliyah. I will cut you out of this family forever, and you will never be welcome in this house again. I stared at the man who had enabled my mother's abuse for 34 years. The man who had stood by and watched them use me as a walking ATM without ever once defending me. Then I threw my head back and laughed. It was a loud, genuine laugh that echoed through the quiet den, bouncing off the walls and chilling the air. Disown me? I asked, wiping a fake tear from my eye. You are going to disown me and kick me out of this house? Yes. Leroy spat, his fists clenched at his sides. You are done here. I smiled at him. A slow, sharp smile that made the color drain from his face. Disown me then, Leroy, I said, my voice dripping with absolute venom. But if you disown me, who is going to pay the $150,000 second mortgage on this mansion? Leroy froze. His chest stopped heaving and his arms fell limply to his sides. The silence in the den was so absolute that I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Bernice looked from me to her husband, her carefully contoured face twisting into a mask of pure confusion. She demanded to know what I meant, telling Leroy that the house had been fully paid off for a decade. She told him to look at me and tell me I was lying. But Leroy could not look at her. He kept his eyes glued to the Persian rug beneath his feet. His jaw worked silently, and his eyes darted toward the locked den doors as if he wanted to bolt. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and knew that moving a single muscle would blow him to pieces. Since Leroy has suddenly lost his ability to speak, I will explain it to you, Mother, I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the center of the room. 3 years ago, your perfect husband secretly leveraged the equity in this magnificent estate. He took out a massive second mortgage to fund Malik's brilliant real estate venture down in Florida. You know the one. The venture that was supposed to make Malik a millionaire by 30, but instead ended with federal tax liens and a string of angry investors demanding their money back. Malik backed away until his shoulders hit the bookshelves. He looked like a terrified child. Megan stared at her husband, her eyes wide with mounting horror as she realized the man she married was entirely built on lies and borrowed money. I kept my voice calm and measured, refusing to give them the satisfaction of my anger. The venture collapsed, and Leroy could not make the mortgage payments. The bank sent foreclosure notices. They were preparing to seize the property and auction it off right out from under you. Leroy came to me in tears. He drove all the way to Chicago and sat in my office begging me to save him. He said losing the house would destroy your reputation in the community, Bernice. He asked me for a loan. Bernice let out a choked sob. She looked at Leroy, her carefully applied makeup starting to run as tears welled in her eyes. "You almost lost my home," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You risked my home for his foolishness." "It gets better," I said, drawing their attention back to me. I knew that giving Leroy cash was like pouring water into a bottomless pit. Malik would just find a way to drain it again. So I refused the loan. Instead, I bypassed Leroy entirely. I formed a private limited liability company named Obsidian Properties. I used my own capital to purchase the debt directly from the bank. I paid off the primary and the secondary mortgages in full, effectively buying the house in cash. Megan shook her head, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face. "Obsidian Properties is the corporate management group," she stammered. "Malik showed me the lease agreement. He said the family transferred the deed for tax benefits, and we just leased it back." "He lied to you, Megan," I said, not even blinking. "Leroy transferred the deed to avoid public foreclosure and total bankruptcy. And I am the sole owner of Obsidian Properties. I am the landlord. I own the marble floors you walk on. I own the crystal chandeliers you show off to your friends. I own the roof over your head. You are not wealthy homeowners hosting lavish brunches. You are my non-paying tenants living here on a $0 lease agreement that I can terminate at any time." The reality of the situation crashed over them like a tidal wave. Bernice looked around the grand den, touching the velvet sofa as if it might vanish into thin air. The illusion of their generational wealth, the very foundation of their arrogance, had been utterly obliterated. They had nothing. They were standing in a glass house, and I was holding the hammer. Leroy finally found his voice, dropping his arrogant posture and holding his hands out in a desperate, pleading gesture. "Aaliyah, please," he begged, his voice trembling. "Do not do this. We can work something out. I can find a job. We can set up a payment plan. Do not take your mother's home away from her. It stopped being her home the day you gambled it away to protect your golden child," I replied coldly. "And it stopped being a safe haven for me the moment you all stood in that dining room and toasted to my absence. You called me an ugly bank account, Leroy. You told me you were going to disown me and kick me out of this house. The bitter irony is that I am the only person in this room with the legal authority to evict anyone." Megan suddenly marched forward, her face contorted into a mask of pure denial. She pointed a shaking finger at me, her chest heaving with desperate rage. "You are lying!" She spat, her voice shrill and panicked. "You are making all of this up just to scare us because you are jealous." Malik showed me the corporate filings. "Obsidian Properties is a massive firm. There is no way you own it. You are just a low-level financial analyst living in a cramped apartment in Chicago. You wear cheap thrift store clothes and drive a piece of garbage car. You cannot afford a $5 million estate. You are a liar." I looked at Megan, watching her cling to her delusions of superiority. She desperately needed me to be the poor, ugly sister-in-law because without that narrative, she was nothing but a broke woman married to a fraud. I opened my mouth to tell her exactly how many millions sat in my primary investment portfolio. But before I could speak, a loud, melodious chime echoed through the entire house. It was the front doorbell. The heavy mahogany doors of the den muffled the sound slightly, but it was unmistakable. The caterers had finished setting up the courtyard, and the main event was officially beginning. The wealthy VIP guests, Megan had invited her high society friends, and my mother's elite church members had arrived for the Mother's Day brunch. The sound of the doorbell echoing through the mansion broke the paralysis in the room. Megan gasped, her hands flying to her face as the reality of her guests arriving collided with the absolute disaster unfolding in the den. Malik scrambled away from the bookshelves, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy mahogany doors he had locked just minutes ago. Bernice immediately began smoothing her silk dress and dabbing at her ruined makeup, trying to resurrect the illusion of the wealthy matriarch she had played for so long. Leroy stood frozen, looking like a man waiting for his execution, unable to process that his entire world was crumbling. Megan rushed to the door and fumbled with the deadbolt, her hands shaking so badly she could barely turn the lock. She threw it open, and the sounds of classical music and chattering voices flooded into our tense silence. The foyer was quickly filling with affluent, mostly white couples wearing pastel spring suits and designer sundresses. They were the kind of people who judged a person's entire worth by the brand of their shoes and the zip code of their primary residence. These were the people Megan desperately needed to impress, to secure her status in the local elite. The smell of expensive cologne and imported perfume drifted into the hallway, mingling with the tension we had just created. As the guests began moving toward the grand dining room, Megan spun around and glared at me. Her panic had instantly morphed back into vicious arrogance. The instinct to hide the family shame was so deeply ingrained in her that she completely forgot I was the one holding the deed to the property. She grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my skin, and tried to shove me toward the secondary hallway that led to the catering kitchen. "You need to get out of here right now," she hissed, her voice a desperate, frantic whisper. "Go through the kitchen and leave out the back door. My guests cannot see you looking like this. They will think you are one of the kitchen staff who wandered off the clock. I am not letting your thrift store aesthetic ruin my reputation today of all days." I looked down at the hand gripping my arm and then up at Megan's flushed, panicked face. I did not budge a single inch. My feet remained planted firmly on the Persian rug of my own house. I calmly reached over and peeled her fingers off my sleeve one by one. My touch was cold and resolute. "I am not going anywhere, Megan," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the soft music drifting in from the courtyard. "I am the landlord, and it is highly inappropriate for the property owner to hide in the service quarters while non-paying tenants host unauthorized parties. Besides, I would hate to miss the look on your face when these people find out your entire life is funded by the very woman you are trying to shove out the back door." Megan turned pale, her eyes wide with terror as several guests began to filter into the hallway near the open den doors. Bernice hurried out, trying to intercept them, her voice artificially high and sweet as she welcomed them to the estate. Leroy followed closely behind, acting as the gracious host, though his hands were trembling so badly he had to shove them into his pockets. They were putting on the performance of a lifetime, desperate to keep the illusion alive for just a few more hours. I stepped out of the den and into the bright light of the main hallway. Megan scrambled after me, trying to block me from the view of a group of wealthy investors she had been bragging about for weeks. She positioned herself between me and the guests, plastering a fake smile on her face while gesturing vaguely toward the kitchen, trying to physically herd me away from the pristine foyer. "Oh, pay no attention to her," Megan laughed nervously, addressing a tall man in a tailored gray suit who was admiring the architecture of the vaulted ceiling. "She is just one of the caterer's assistants who got a bit lost looking for the service entrance. Good help is so hard to find these days, is it not? It is so difficult to find reliable staff who know how to stay in their proper place." I stopped walking and turned to face the group of guests. I stood tall, making no effort to hide my natural hair or my simple clothes. I did not need designer logos to validate my existence. My presence alone was powerful enough to command the space. I looked directly at the man Megan was trying so desperately to impress. The tall man in the gray suit turned away from the architectural molding and looked toward Megan. He had a polite smile on his face, ready to agree with his hostess's casual snobbery as was expected in these social circles. But as his eyes moved past Megan and landed on me, his polite smile vanished entirely. His eyes widened in genuine shock, and he took a sudden, eager step forward, completely ignoring Megan's outstretched hand. He bypassed my sister-in-law, entirely pushing past her to stand directly in front of me. The man who Megan had been trying to court for months, the man whose approval could make or break her social standing, suddenly bowed his head in a gesture of profound respect. "Miss Aaliyah," he exclaimed, his voice echoing through the foyer, carrying over the music and the chatter. "What an absolute honor to see you here. I had no idea you were in Atlanta. Your keynote speech on investment strategies at Wall Street last week was absolutely brilliant. Our entire hedge fund has been restructuring our portfolios based on your analysis. We have been trying to get a meeting with your firm for months. The entire foyer went dead silent. The classical music playing in the background seemed to fade into nothingness. Megan stood frozen, her hand still hovering in the air, her mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. Malik, who had just stepped out of the den, looked as though he might pass out right there on the marble floor. Bernice and Leroy turned around slowly, staring at the wealthy hedge fund manager, who was currently treating their ugly scapegoat daughter like absolute royalty. The silence in the foyer was so profound you could hear the ice melting in the crystal pitchers in the next room. Megan stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water as she stared at the wealthy hedge fund manager. He was completely ignoring her existence and looking at me as if I held the keys to the universe. Malik looked physically ill, his eyes darting between my plain clothes and the respectful posture of the man in the tailored suit. Bernice and Leroy were paralyzed, their meticulously crafted lies crumbling right in front of their eyes. I offered the manager a polite but measured smile, acknowledging his praise without letting it inflate my ego. "It is a pleasure to meet you," I said, my voice calm and authoritative. "I am always glad to hear that my Wall Street strategies are making an impact. My firm prides itself on identifying undervalued assets and exposing fraudulent market behaviors." The manager nodded eagerly, hanging on my every word. He began asking highly technical questions about market volatility and offshore accounts, completely turning his back on Megan and her carefully curated welcome speech. Within moments, the commotion drew the attention of the other affluent guests who had filtered into the hallway. A female executive from a prominent real estate group gasped and pushed her way to the front of the crowd. She looked at me with genuine admiration and asked if I was the same Aaliyah who had recently closed the multi-million-dollar acquisition of the downtown commercial district. When I nodded, the hallway erupted into a flurry of excited whispers. These were the people Megan had spent months trying to impress, spending money she did not have just to get them to step foot in this house. Now they were all crowding around me, practically begging for a moment of my time to network and seek financial advice. Megan tried desperately to regain control of her ruined party. She plastered on a frantic smile and stepped into the circle holding a silver tray of mimosas. She raised her voice, attempting to sound light and breezy, as she invited everyone to step out to the courtyard for caviar and champagne. She tried to touch the arm of the hedge fund manager to guide him away, but he simply stepped out of her reach without even looking at her. He brushed her off, exactly the way one might brush off an overbearing waitress, and continued asking me about my investment portfolio. The sheer panic in Megan's eyes was glorious to witness. She tried again, this time targeting the real estate executive, offering her a napkin and gesturing toward the dining room. The executive took the napkin without making eye contact, keeping her focus entirely on me as she asked for my business card. Megan stood there holding her tray, her face burning with a humiliation so deep it radiated off her skin. The people she worshipped were treating her like hired help in the very house she pretended to own. Her white privilege and designer bags meant absolutely nothing in the face of true generational wealth and earned power. My parents watched this social execution happen in real time. Leroy looked defeated. His shoulders slumped as he finally realized the magnitude of my success and the reality of his own pathetic situation. His golden child son was a penniless fraud, and the daughter he treated like garbage was a titan of industry. But Bernice was different. My mother possessed a survival instinct built entirely on narcissism and delusion. As she watched the most powerful people in her social circle treating me like a financial deity, the gears in her head shifted. She saw an opportunity to elevate her own status by latching onto the daughter she had just spent the morning tearing down. Bernice shoved her way past Megan, nearly knocking the tray of drinks out of her hands. She beamed at the crowd of investors and executives, her face glowing with manufactured maternal pride. She threw her arm around my shoulder, gripping me tightly as if we were the closest family in the world. Her expensive perfume washed over me, mixing with the stench of her hypocrisy. "Well, of course she is a brilliant strategist," Bernice announced to the crowd, her voice loud and dripping with fake affection. "This is my daughter, everyone, my beautiful, successful Aaliyah. I always knew she was destined for greatness. I poured my heart and soul into raising her right. I taught her everything she knows about hard work and financial responsibility. A mother knows when she has raised a genius, and I have always been her biggest supporter." She squeezed my shoulder, pulling me closer for the benefit of the onlookers. The guests smiled politely at my mother, murmuring their compliments about what a wonderful job she had done raising such an incredible woman. Bernice soaked up their praise like a sponge, her chest puffing out as she finally got the attention and validation she craved. She looked at me, her eyes silently pleading with me to play along to uphold the facade of the perfect, loving family in front of these important people. She thought the promise of social status would be enough to buy my silence. She thought I would swallow my trauma just to keep up appearances and protect the family name. I slowly reached up and removed her hand from my shoulder, letting her arm drop awkwardly to her side. I did not do it aggressively, but with a firm, cold finality that made the gesture impossible to misinterpret. The guests noticed the movement, and their polite smiles faltered. The air in the foyer grew thick with renewed tension. The easy networking atmosphere evaporated instantly, replaced by the heavy, suffocating weight of an impending confrontation. I looked at the crowd of wealthy executives and then turned my cold gaze back to my mother. "Raised me right?" I asked, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet tone that made every single person in the room lean in to listen. "You mean like when you stole the money from my college tuition fund to pay the bail bondsman to get Malik out of jail for his illegal gambling charges?" Bernice gasped, her face draining of all color. Her jaw dropped and she took a staggering step backward. The guests behind her let out a collective shock of horror, staring at my mother as if she had just confessed to a brutal crime. The hedge fund manager lowered his glass, his eyes wide with disbelief. Malik let out a choked noise from the back of the hallway, trying to shrink into the shadows to escape the sudden glare of public scrutiny. I just smiled coldly at the crowd, letting the absolute devastation of my words settle over the room. The hedge fund manager cleared his throat, shifting his weight awkwardly as he looked from my mother to me. The admiration he held for my professional success was now mixed with a deep, visible discomfort at the toxic reality of my family dynamics. He did not ask for clarification. People of his status do not involve themselves in messy domestic disputes. He simply adjusted his suit jacket, offered me a brief, respectful nod, and announced that he had another pressing engagement to attend to. The real estate executive followed his lead immediately. She murmured a quick apology about double booking her Sunday schedule and turned on her heel, heading straight for the massive oak doors. The sudden exodus broke the spell that had frozen the rest of the guests. One by one, the wealthy investors, church leaders, and socialites Megan had so desperately courted began moving toward the exit. They muttered vague excuses, avoiding eye contact with my parents and my sister-in-law. Megan chased after them, her voice high and panicked. She begged them to stay, promising that the caviar was just being served and that there was a misunderstanding. She reached out to grab the arm of a prominent socialite, but the woman gently pulled away, offering a tight-lipped smile before rushing out the door. Within 5 minutes, the grand foyer was completely empty of outsiders. The lavish Mother's Day brunch was ruined before it even began. The silence they left behind was heavier than before, thick with the stench of exposed lies and ruined reputations. Bernice let out a ragged breath, covering her face with her hands. She collapsed against the hallway table, knocking over a crystal vase that shattered into a dozen pieces on the marble floor. She did not even look at the broken glass. She just stared at the empty doorway, realizing that her carefully constructed image, the facade she had sacrificed my childhood to build, was gone forever. Her church friends would whisper about her by evening. Her social standing was obliterated. Leroy stood frozen, his face pale and slack. He looked at me, not with anger, but with a profound, hollow realization that he had bet on the wrong child and lost everything. But Malik was a different story. The panic and fear that had consumed him when his credit cards declined suddenly mutated into a violent, explosive rage. His golden child persona burned away entirely, leaving only the entitled parasite I always knew him to be. He lunged forward, crossing the foyer in 3 massive strides until he was standing just inches from my face. His fists were clenched so tight his knuckles were white and the veins in his neck bulged. "You think this is funny, Aelia?" He spat, his voice trembling with fury. "You think you can just walk in here, humiliate my wife, destroy my mother's party, and act like you are better than us? You have millions of dollars sitting in the bank. You own this house. You are making 7 figures a year, and you watched me struggle. You let me beg for $50,000 when you could have written a check without even noticing it was gone." I did not flinch. I stood my ground, looking up into the eyes of a man who had stolen my money to gamble and buy fake Rolexes. "I did not make you struggle, Malik," I replied, my voice deadly calm. "You chose to be a failure. You chose to steal and lie and gamble away every opportunity this family handed to you on a silver platter." "We are family!" Malik screamed, spitting the words at me. "You owe me, Aaliyah. You owe this family for raising you. If you are sitting on all that wealth, then I deserve a cut. We all deserve a cut. You think you can just keep it all to yourself while your own blood goes bankrupt? Give me my share. Pay off my debts and sign over a piece of that portfolio. It is the least you can do after what you just did to our mother's reputation." I laughed. It was a short, sharp sound that cut through his delusional rant. "Your cut?" I asked, stepping closer to him, so he had to look down at me. "Your cut was the $200,000 you stole from me 3 years ago. Your cut was the college tuition you drained from my accounts. You have been taking your cut your entire life, Malik. The bank is closed. There is no more money for you. There is no more blind loyalty. You are nothing but a thief wearing an expensive suit you cannot afford." Malik raised his hand as if he was going to strike me. Leroy finally snapped out of his daze and shouted his name, telling him to step back. Megan let out a whimper, cowering near the dining room entrance. But before Malik could make another move, a sudden violent pounding echoed through the grand foyer. The sound was so loud and aggressive that it made the heavy oak doors shake on their hinges. It was not the polite knock of a returning guest or a confused caterer. It was the hard, authoritative pounding of law enforcement. Malik froze, his raised hand slowly lowering to his side. Bernice gasped, clutching Leroy's arm as the pounding came again, louder this time. Megan let out a terrified sob, backing away until she hit the wall. I calmly walked around my brother and pulled open the front door. Standing on the porch was a tall, broad-shouldered sheriff's deputy with his hand resting on his utility belt. Right beside him, holding a thick leather briefcase, was Attorney Davis, my legal counsel. His sharp eyes swept over the terrified faces of my family before landing on me with a nod of professional confirmation. Attorney Davis stepped smoothly over the threshold, holding up a stack of official documents bearing the seal of the federal court. The deputy stepped in right behind him, his presence instantly draining whatever fight was left in the room. "Nobody move," the deputy ordered, his voice echoing like thunder in the marble foyer. "This property is now a locked-down crime scene." Nobody moved. The deputy's words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Malik stood completely paralyzed, his eyes darting wildly between the uniform and the heavy briefcase in Attorney Davis' hand. Bernice let out a low, whimpering sound, clutching Leroy's arm as if her husband could somehow shield her from the federal government. Megan was practically vibrating with terror, pressing her back so hard against the wall I thought she might break right through the drywall. Attorney Davis did not spare them a single ounce of sympathy. He walked past the shattered crystal vase on the floor, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the marble. He stopped at the grand entryway table and laid his briefcase down flat. The sharp snaps of the metal latches popping open sounded like gunshots in the dead quiet foyer. He reached inside and pulled out a thick manila folder, dropping it onto the polished wood with a heavy thud. "This is no longer a simple family dispute over stolen credit cards," Davis announced, his voice calm, projecting the terrifying certainty of a man who held all the winning cards. Mrs. Aaliyah retained my firm to conduct a comprehensive audit of her financial portfolio after detecting the initial anomalies. What we found goes far beyond unauthorized shopping sprees and luxury handbags. Davis opened the folder and spread out several dense legal contracts. These are Federal Small Business Administration loan applications. He continued, pointing to the prominent government seals on the top pages. 2 separate applications filed in the last 18 months, totaling over $800,000. The funds were dispersed to a shell company registered jointly to Malik and Megan. But the primary guarantor, the individual whose pristine credit score and financial history secured these federal funds, is listed as Aaliyah. Malik let out a choked gasp, shaking his head back and forth. He started to say that he did not do it, but his voice gave out completely. I asked him what exactly he did not do. I told him not to deny forging my signature on federal documents. I told him not to deny fabricating tax returns to prove to the government that my income was actually his to leverage. My legal team had already tracked the digital footprints. We knew exactly which IP address submitted the applications, and it traced directly back to the router in this very house. And it does not stop at loan fraud, Davis added smoothly, turning to another page in the massive file. The audit revealed gross misrepresentations on your joint tax filings. You claimed phantom losses from businesses that do not exist to offset the capital gains you were siphoning from Miss Aaliyah's accounts. You lied to the Internal Revenue Service. You actively defrauded the federal government of the United States. Bernice began to weep openly, her sobs echoing in the hallway. Leroy stared at his son with a look of absolute horror, finally realizing that the golden child had doomed them all. The deputy took a step forward, resting his hand on his radio. He stated clearly that forgery of federal loan documents, identity theft, and tax evasion are not civil matters. They are federal crimes. Davis looked directly at Malik and then at Megan. He explained that the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the IRS do not care about their toxic family dynamic. They do not care about the Mother's Day brunch or the country club reputation. They care that nearly $1 million of government-backed funds were stolen. The mandatory minimum sentencing for wire fraud of this magnitude, combined with aggravated identity theft, carries a penalty of up to 30 years in federal prison. 30 years. The words echoed off the vaulted ceilings. I watched the exact moment the delusion shattered completely inside Megan's mind. The arrogant, smug woman who had mocked my natural hair and my simple clothes just 20 minutes ago was entirely gone. In her place was a terrified, cornered animal, realizing that her pristine suburban life was over. Federal prison meant the end of her exclusive memberships and her luxury vacations. It meant the end of her designer bags and her leased Porsches. But more importantly for Megan, it meant the absolute destruction of her freedom. She knew that her privilege would not save her from a federal paper trail that clearly bore her electronic signature alongside her husband's. The government had the receipts, and the government never loses. Megan began to hyperventilate. Her chest heaved as she gasped for air, her eyes wide and bloodshot. She looked at the armed deputy, then at the thick stack of federal evidence on the table, and finally at Malik. Malik reached out a trembling hand toward his wife, whispering her name, pleading for some kind of solidarity in the face of absolute ruin. He looked like a drowning man reaching for a life preserver. But there is no loyalty among thieves. Megan slapped his hand away with a vicious shriek. She backed away from him as if he were covered in a deadly disease, holding her hands up in the air to physically distance herself from his sinking ship. "I did not do it!" Megan screamed, her voice tearing through the foyer and bouncing off the marble floors. It was him. It was all him. Was all. He told me he had permission to use the funds. He told me Aaliyah was a silent partner in our business. I did not sign those federal papers. He forged everything. He used my laptop to hide his tracks so the IP address would point to me. Please, You have to believe me, because I have children and I cannot go to prison for what he did. She pointed a shaking manicured finger directly at her husband's face. She threw the golden child squarely under the wheels of the federal government to save herself, abandoning her vows and her pride in a single desperate breath. Malik stared at the woman he married, the woman whose expensive tastes had driven him to steal from his own sister. His mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. The shock of her absolute betrayal seemed to paralyze his vocal cords. When he finally found his voice, it was a guttural scream of pure rage that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "You lying snake," Malik yelled, lunging toward her. But the sheriff deputy stepped smoothly between them, resting a heavy hand on Malik's chest to keep him back. "You knew exactly where every single dime came from, Megan. You sat right next to me at the kitchen table while I filled out those federal loan applications. You were the one who suggested we use Aaliyah's credit profile because your own credit was garbage and you desperately needed that kitchen renovation to impress your country club friends." Megan shook her head violently, her perfectly styled blonde hair whipping across her tear-stained face. She looked at Attorney Davis with wild, desperate eyes, completely ignoring her furious husband. "I will testify against him." She practically hyperventilated, her voice shrill and panicked. "I will tell the federal investigators everything they want to know. I will give them his laptops, his passwords, his hidden offshore account numbers. I am filing for divorce the second I leave this house. I will not let this narcissistic loser drag me down with him. I am a mother, and I will not go to federal prison for his mistakes." I watched them tear each other apart with a cold, clinical fascination. The sacred vows they had taken, the lavish wedding my parents had funded to the tune of thousands of dollars. It all dissolved into dust the moment federal prison became a reality. There was no love here. There was only mutual parasitism, and the host had just cut the cord. The collapse of the golden child's marriage was only the beginning of the carnage. Leroy, who had been standing frozen near the dining room entrance, suddenly spun around to face my mother. His eyes were wide and manic, filled with the frantic energy of a coward looking for a scapegoat to bear the weight of his own failures. "This is your fault," Leroy shouted, pointing an accusing, trembling finger right at Bernice's perfectly contoured face. "You created this monster, Bernice. You coddled him since the day he was born and told him he was better than everyone else. You let him get away with murder and you forced me to look the other way." Bernice gasped, taking a staggering step back, as if her husband had physically struck her. "How dare you blame me?" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the marble walls like breaking glass. "You are his father. You were supposed to lead this household. You were supposed to teach him how to be a man. I led this household right into the ground because I was too busy trying to fund your ridiculous country club lifestyle." Leroy fired back, his voice cracking with years of suppressed resentment finally boiling over. "You made me take out that second mortgage. You made me enable his fake businesses because you could not stand the thought of your elite church friends finding out your precious son was a total failure. You sacrificed our financial security, and you sacrificed Aaliyah's future just so you could keep playing the wealthy matriarch for people who do not even care about you." "You weak, pathetic man!" Bernice screamed back, tears of absolute fury streaming down her face, ruining her expensive cosmetics. "You went along with it because you liked the prestigious dinners just as much as I did. You liked the status. You never protected this family, and now you are throwing me under the bus to save your own skin." It was a spectacular display of absolute hypocrisy. The unified front they had always presented, the united wall of arrogance they used to crush me for 34 years, had completely disintegrated in less than 10 minutes. They were a pack of starving wolves turning their teeth on each other the second the meat ran out. Nobody was willing to take responsibility for the fraud. Nobody was willing to protect anyone else. The deep family loyalty they had always preached about the blood is thicker than water nonsense. They used to keep me in line and extract my money was nothing but a convenient lie. They were loyal to my bank accounts and nothing else. As Leroy and Bernice continued to scream at each other, hurling decades of bitter resentments across the grand foyer, Malik sank to the floor, putting his head between his knees as the armed deputy watched him closely. Megan was still sobbing against the wall, muttering frantically about divorce lawyers and immunity deals, trying to calculate how to save her own suburban lifestyle. The Grandmother's Day brunch had devolved into a complete circus of legal peril and shattered egos. Attorney Davis stood quietly beside me, his professional demeanor completely unshaken by the domestic explosion happening around us. Bernice suddenly stopped screaming at Leroy. She looked around the ruined foyer, taking in the sight of her son, facing federal charges, her daughter-in-law plotting a ruthless betrayal, and her husband washing his hands of her entirely. The reality of her total destruction finally registered in her eyes. Her social standing was gone. Her fake wealth was gone. Her golden child was going to prison. She turned slowly to look at me, standing there calm and untouchable, in the very center of the house she used to rule. The arrogant pride, the deliberate cruelty that had defined her entire relationship with me, completely broke under the weight of her desperation. Bernice took 3 trembling steps toward me, and then her knees buckled. She dropped heavily onto the hard marble floor, landing right at my feet. The sound of her knees hitting the stone was sickening, but she did not even seem to feel the physical pain. She looked up at me, her face a wet, twisted mess of sheer terror. She grabbed the hem of my simple cotton blouse, her manicured hands shaking violently. "I am your mother," Bernice sobbed, her voice tearing through her throat in a raw, agonizing plea. "Blood is thicker than money, Aaliyah. You cannot do this to us. You cannot send your own brother to prison." I looked down at the woman kneeling on the marble floor. My mother, the great matriarch of the family whose entire existence was built on looking down her nose at me, was now clutching the hem of my shirt like a beggar. Her tears soaked into the fabric, but I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no guilt. The well of daughterly devotion had run completely dry. Blood is thicker than money. I repeated, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "That is a fascinating philosophy, Bernice. Let us talk about blood then." I took a deliberate step back, forcing her to let go of my shirt. Her hands fell to the floor and she slumped forward, a pathetic picture of ruined pride. I looked her dead in the eye, watching the desperation twist her carefully contoured features. She was waiting for me to cave. She was waiting for the dutiful daughter who always stepped up to save the family from their own disastrous choices to magically reappear just like I always did. "Thank God, Aaliyah did not show up today," I said, perfectly mimicking the cheerful, arrogant tone Malik had used just an hour ago. "She completely ruins the aesthetic of a luxury party." Bernice's breath hitched in her throat. Her eyes widened so much I thought they might roll out of her head. The muffled sobbing from Megan stopped instantly. Even Leroy froze, staring at me with a sickening realization. Malik, who had been staring at the floor, suddenly jerked his head up, his mouth falling open in sheer terror. I did not stop. I kept my voice steady, reciting every single word I had heard through the open dining room window, painting the foyer with the ugly truth of their betrayal. "And then you chimed in, Mother," I continued, crossing my arms and staring down at her. "You said I was not a pretty girl and that I lacked class. You told your favorite son and your precious daughter-in-law that I was just a walking ATM for this family. You said that as long as I kept funding Malik's lifestyle, I could be as ugly and socially awkward as I wanted, just as long as I stayed in Chicago and did not ruin your perfect Mother's Day aesthetic." Bernice began to shake violently. Her mouth opened and closed, but the lies she desperately needed to spin died in her throat. She knew she was caught. She knew there was no way to gaslight her way out of an exact quote. She looked at Leroy for help, but he turned his head away, unable to meet my gaze. "You heard us?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. "You were outside. I bought you a $5,000 custom diamond tennis bracelet. I said, my tone dropping to a deadly whisper. I bought imported orchids. I drove down here because my therapist suggested I try one last time to build a bridge with the woman who gave birth to me. I stood on that front porch, and I listened to my entire family raise their crystal glasses and toast to my absence. I walked around her kneeling form, stepping toward the center of the foyer, so I could address all of them at once. The armed deputy stood silently by the door, watching the emotional execution unfold with stoic professionalism. "You never viewed me as a daughter, Bernice," I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "You never loved me. You only loved what I could do for you. You looked at my dark skin and my natural hair, and you decided I was defective because I did not fit into your shallow, superficial world. So you used me as a shield to hide the rot in this family. You used my bank accounts to cover up the fact that your husband is a failure and your golden child is a fraudulent gambling addict." "Aaliyah, please," Bernice sobbed, reaching a trembling hand toward me again, her fake eyelashes clumping together as the mascara ran down her cheeks. "We were just talking. It was just a stupid joke. You know we love you. You are my baby girl. You cannot let the government take my son away." "I am your landlord," I corrected her sharply, slicing through her pathetic attempt at manipulation. "And I am the primary victim of a federal financial crime committed by your son and his wife. There is no love here, Mother. There is only a parasite, and the host who finally decided to cut the cord. You protected Malik from the consequences of his actions his entire life. You bailed him out, you covered for him, and you stole from me to finance his delusions. Well, you cannot protect him from the federal government." Leroy finally found the courage to speak, his voice shaking. "Aaliyah, you are destroying this family. This family destroyed itself." "Leroy?" I fired back without missing a beat. "I just stopped paying the cleanup bill." Attorney Davis stepped forward exactly on cue. He unlatched a secondary compartment in his briefcase and pulled out a single crisp document bearing a red official stamp from the county court. He handed it directly to me. The satisfying rustle of the thick legal paper was the only sound in the room for a long, breathless moment. I looked at the paper and then looked back at the pathetic group of people cowering in my foyer. The years of emotional abuse, the constant microaggressions, the financial exploitation, the sleepless nights wondering why I was never good enough for my own mother. It all ended right here on this marble floor. The toxic fortress they had built using my money had finally collapsed. "Crying time is over!" I announced, my voice hard and absolute, echoing through the grand house for the very last time. "The eviction notice went into effect yesterday. You all have exactly 15 minutes to pack your personal belongings." "15 minutes!" Bernice shrieked, scrambling to her feet, her sudden burst of energy fueled by pure delusion. "You cannot be serious, Aaliyah. We are not packing anything. This is my home and I am not leaving it. You can wave those papers around all you want, but I will not be intimidated by my own child." Leroy stepped up beside her, trying to present a united front, even though his hands were still shaking. He told me I was taking things too far and that the police would never throw an elderly couple out onto the lawn without a court hearing. Attorney Davis calmly adjusted his glasses and informed my father that the eviction had already been processed through the civil courts weeks ago. He explained that because the property was commercially owned by Obsidian Properties and there was no valid lease agreement, the local magistrate had granted an immediate writ of possession. The armed deputy standing by the door shifted his weight and confirmed that he was there to execute that exact writ. He told them they could either pack their bags peacefully or be escorted out in handcuffs for trespassing. Megan let out a loud wailing sound, sliding down the wall until she was sitting on the marble floor. She started pulling at her blonde hair, muttering that this could not be happening to her. She said her children were going to be homeless and that her entire life was ruined. Malik remained frozen, staring at me with a look of pure hatred. He finally found his voice and told me I was a monster. He said I was destroying his family out of petty jealousy because I could never fit into their world. I did not even bother to answer him. The sheer irony of a thief calling his victim a monster was not worth my breath. I just stared right back at him, letting the silence stretch until he looked away. Before Malik could hurl another insult, a loud, mechanical roaring sound interrupted the tense standoff in the foyer. It was the heavy, distinct rumble of large diesel engines echoing up the long, winding driveway of the estate. The sound was entirely out of place in this quiet, affluent neighborhood, where the only vehicles you usually heard were silent electric sedans and expensive luxury imports. The heavy rumbling was soon accompanied by the sharp, piercing beep of commercial vehicles backing up. Malik turned his head toward the grand bay windows, his eyes widening as flashing amber lights reflected off the glass. He slowly walked toward the window like a man approaching a ghost. Megan stopped sobbing and pushed herself up from the floor, stumbling over to look out the window beside her husband. Her jaw dropped as she registered the scene outside. I stayed exactly where I was standing next to Attorney Davis. I had been tracking their financial ruin for weeks, and I knew exactly what was pulling up to the house. When I reported the massive fraud to the federal banking authorities and froze their accounts, it triggered an automatic default across their entire credit profile. Malik and Megan had been missing their luxury vehicle payments for months, relying on minimum payments from my stolen funds just to keep the lenders at bay. The moment those funds dried up, the banks issued immediate repossession orders. I might have also made a polite phone call to the collection agency to let them know exactly where the vehicles were parked today, to speed up the process. "My car," Malik whispered, his voice cracking with absolute despair. "What are they doing to my car?" Megan let out a blood-curdling scream that tore through the house. She pushed past the deputy and threw open the heavy oak front doors, running out onto the porch in her bare feet. I walked casually toward the open doorway to watch the spectacle unfold. Bernice and Leroy followed behind me, their faces pale with horror. Parked right in the middle of the pristine circular driveway were two massive heavy-duty tow trucks. The repo men, wearing bright yellow safety vests and holding thick metal clipboards, were already at work. One of them had expertly backed his truck right up to Malik's custom black Range Rover and was currently sliding the heavy steel hydraulic lifts under the front tires. The other repo man was attaching thick, heavy chains to the undercarriage of Megan's prized white Porsche Cayenne. The loud clanking of the metal chains hitting the asphalt sounded like the ultimate death knell for their fake luxury lifestyle. Megan sprinted down the front steps, nearly tripping over her own expensive dress. She ran right up to the repo man hooking up her Porsche and started hitting his shoulder. She screamed at him to stop, telling him it was a mistake and that she had the money to pay whatever she owed. The repo man did not even flinch. He calmly stepped back, pulled a printed document from his clipboard, and handed it to her. He told her the vehicle was property of the bank now due to severe default, and advised her to step away from the active towing equipment before she got hurt. Malik stood on the porch, completely paralyzed. The Range Rover he used to project an image of a highly successful entrepreneur, the vehicle he used to impress his fake investors, was currently being hoisted into the air. Its front wheels left the ground and the entire car tilted backward, looking pathetic and defeated. Malik watched his entire identity get strapped to the back of a flatbed truck, but he did not move a muscle to stop it. He knew the federal investigators were already watching his every move, and causing a scene with a repo agency would only add to his massive list of criminal charges. He just stood there, letting the ultimate symbol of his golden child status be ripped away. The loud commotion and the flashing amber lights had drawn the attention of the entire street. This was an exclusive gated community where people paid millions of dollars for privacy and pristine aesthetics. Now the neighborhood was getting a front row seat to a spectacular financial collapse. I watched as doors opened across the street and curious, wealthy neighbors stepped out onto their manicured lawns. People walking their purebred dogs stopped dead in their tracks, staring at the chaotic scene unfolding in our driveway. Some of them were the very same church members and socialites who had just fled the Mother's Day brunch a few minutes prior. They stood on the sidewalks, holding their phones up, whispering and pointing as the tow trucks roared their engines. Bernice stood in the doorway, hiding behind the heavy wooden frame. She was physically shaking as she watched her neighbors witness her absolute destruction. Her social standing, her reputation in the church, her entire identity as a wealthy, successful matriarch was being publicly obliterated right there on the pavement. The carefully crafted illusion she had spent decades building was being stripped away in broad daylight, leaving nothing but the ugly truth of their profound failure. The women she had bragged to the people she had tried to impress, they were all watching her son and daughter-in-law get repossessed like common criminals. The tow trucks finished securing the luxury vehicles. Their heavy diesel engines revved loudly as they shifted into gear. Megan stood barefoot on the driveway, sobbing uncontrollably as her white Porsche was slowly towed away down the street. Malik's Range Rover followed right behind it, the amber lights flashing as they disappeared through the community gates. The driveway was now completely empty except for my beat-up SUV parked quietly to the side. The physical representation of their wealth was gone forever, and the entire neighborhood had watched it happen. Bernice slowly turned away from the horrifying spectacle outside. She looked at me standing calmly in the foyer, holding the eviction notice. The reality of the situation had finally crushed the last remaining ounce of her defiance. She realized that I was not playing a game, and that there was no way out of the trap they had built for themselves. The sheer panic in her eyes was absolute. Her face contorted into a mask of pure desperation as the consequences of a lifetime of abuse finally crashed down on her head. She pointed a trembling finger at the open door and screamed at me, demanding to know her final fate. "Are you going to throw us out onto the streets?" The words tore from my mother's throat, raw and frantic. She looked around the massive foyer, her eyes wide with a terror she could no longer hide. Her carefully constructed reality had completely dissolved, leaving her standing in the rubble of her own arrogance. The neighbors she had spent years trying to impress were now gathered on the sidewalks watching the repossession of her son's vehicles, holding their phones up to record the spectacle. The ultimate humiliation was happening right on her front lawn, and there was absolutely nothing she could do to stop it. She turned back to me, her hands still trembling, pointing toward the open door. "You are throwing us out onto the streets." "Aaliyah," she cried, her voice cracking as the first real tears of the day spilled over her heavily powdered cheeks. "You cannot do this. We have nowhere to go. All our money is tied up in the house. We do not have savings. You cannot just leave your own family homeless." Leroy stepped forward, his pride finally breaking as he realized the sheer magnitude of their situation. He held his hands up in a placating gesture, his eyes pleading with me. "Ah, Leah, please," he begged, his voice trembling. "Your mother is right. We have nothing. If you kick us out today, we literally have nowhere to sleep tonight. You have to give us some time, just a few weeks to figure things out, to find a place." I looked at the two of them standing there completely stripped of their power and their entitlement. The people who had spent my entire life making me feel small were now begging me for shelter. I felt a cold, hollow sensation in my chest. It was not satisfaction exactly, but rather a profound recognition of karma finally completing its circle. I reached into the pocket of my simple cotton blouse and pulled out a small plastic keycard attached to a cheap neon green keychain. I held it up between my thumb and forefinger, letting it catch the light from the crystal chandelier overhead. The silence in the foyer thickened as everyone watched the small piece of plastic. "I am not throwing you out onto the streets," I said, my voice calm and deliberate, slicing through the tension like a razor blade. "I am not that cruel. I actually made arrangements for you this morning right after I heard you all toasting to my absence." I tossed the keycard onto the polished marble floor. It landed with a sharp clatter, sliding a few inches before coming to a stop right near the shattered pieces of the crystal vase my mother had knocked over earlier. "That is the key to room 112. At the Starlight Inn on the south side of town," I announced, watching their faces fall as they recognized the name. "It is not the Four Seasons, and it certainly is not a $5 million estate in a gated community. But it has a roof, a running shower, and 2 double beds. I paid for exactly 7 nights in advance. It is non-refundable and non-transferable." Bernice stared at the cheap neon keychain on the floor, her expression morphing from desperation to absolute horror. The Starlight Inn. She gasped, her voice barely a whisper. That place is a dump, Aaliyah. It is a roach motel. It is in a terrible neighborhood. You cannot expect us to stay there. We would not be safe. It is safe enough, I replied, stepping back and crossing my arms. It is certainly safer than the financial ruin you tried to drag me into. 7 days, Bernice. That is 168 hours for you and Leroy to figure out your next move. You can use that time to call all those wealthy church friends you tried to impress today and see if any of them are willing to take you in. But somehow I doubt they will be answering your calls after the show you just put on for the entire neighborhood. Megan let out a sharp, bitter laugh from her spot against the wall. Her makeup was completely ruined, and her designer dress was wrinkled, but the survival instinct was kicking in. 7 days, she spat, glaring at my parents. You get 7 days in a roach motel. And then what? You have no money, you have no credit, you have nothing. You dragged me into this family, promising me wealth and status, and now I'm going to lose my children because of your idiot son. She pointed a shaking finger at Malik, who was still staring blankly out the window at the empty driveway where his Range Rover used to be. Megan turned her furious gaze to me, her eyes wide and manic. I am not going to that motel, Aaliyah, she shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. I have a degree. I have connections. I am leaving him, and I am taking my kids back to my parents' house in Buckhead. I will tell the FBI everything they want to know about his little loan applications. I did not respond to her. Her suburban white privilege was fully activated, desperate to distance herself from the criminal fallout of the man she had happily spent stolen money with just hours ago. I just watched as the family unit completely imploded, turning on each other with the viciousness of cornered animals. The sheriff deputy, who had been standing silently by the door, observing the entire exchange, finally stepped forward. He unhooked his radio, dropping his hand to his utility belt. The sudden movement drew everyone's attention, snapping them out of their toxic spiral. All right, the deputy said, his voice deep and authoritative, cutting through the chaos. You heard the property owner. The eviction writ is valid and active. You have exactly 15 minutes to gather whatever personal necessities you can carry in your hands. Clothing, toiletries, medications. No furniture, no electronics, no valuables that belong to the estate. After 15 minutes, you will vacate the premises or you will be arrested for trespassing. Bernice let out another wail, dropping to the floor to frantically scoop up the cheap neon motel keycard, clutching it to her chest like a lifeline. Leroy grabbed her arm, pulling her up and practically dragging her toward the grand staircase to pack whatever they could salvage of their ruined lives. But Malik did not move toward the stairs. The golden child, the man who had built his entire identity on the illusion of wealth and superiority, suddenly snapped. The reality of the repo trucks, the federal fraud charges, and his wife's immediate betrayal collided in his mind, shattering his fragile ego completely. He spun around away from the window, his face contorted with a blind, desperate rage. He ignored his crying mother and his panicked father. He locked his eyes on me, his fists clenching so tight his knuckles popped. This is all your fault, Malik screamed, launching himself across the foyer toward me. You planned this. You set me up. He did not make it 3 steps. The sheriff deputy moved with terrifying speed, stepping smoothly into Malik's path and driving a heavy shoulder directly into my brother's chest. The impact stopped Malik dead in his tracks, knocking the wind out of him. Before Malik could even react, the deputy grabbed his arm, twisting it forcefully behind his back and shoving him face first against the mahogany wall. The sound of the heavy metal handcuffs clicking into place echoed sharply through the grand foyer, drowning out Bernice's sudden terrified scream. Malik James! The deputy announced, his voice completely devoid of emotion as he secured the cuffs tight against my brother's wrists. You are under arrest. The federal warrant for wire fraud and aggravated identity theft just went active in the system 10 minutes ago. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The deputy did not waste any time. He spun Malik around and marched him straight out the heavy oak doors. Malik did not fight back anymore. All the fight had been drained out of him the moment the cold steel locked around his wrists. He kept his head down, avoiding the gaze of the neighbors who were still standing on the sidewalks recording the entire humiliating scene. The flashing red and blue lights of the sheriff cruiser reflected off the marble foyer, painting the walls with the reality of his federal crimes. Megan watched her husband being shoved into the back of the police car. She did not cry out for him. She did not run to the door to say goodbye. She just stood there, shivering slightly in her designer dress. When the heavy car door slammed shut, Megan slowly turned her attention back to me. She took a deep breath, and I could see the exact moment she decided to switch tactics. The panicked, betrayed wife routine had not worked, so she reached for the ultimate weapon in her arsenal. She reached for her white tears. Her eyes welled up with perfectly timed moisture. Her lower lip trembled, and she crossed her arms over her chest, making herself look as small and fragile as possible. She took a slow, hesitant step toward me, her voice dropping to a soft, pleading whisper. "Aaliyah, please," she whimpered, letting a single tear fall down her cheek. "I know you are angry. I know what Malik did was unforgivable, but you have to believe me when I say I was trapped. He manipulated me just like he manipulated your parents. I was just a victim in all of this, trying to hold my family together." I looked at her, watching the performance. It was a masterclass in suburban white woman victimhood. She was weaponizing her fragility, hoping that if she cried hard enough, I would suddenly forget the vicious, racist insults she had hurled at me less than an hour ago. "I do not have anywhere to go, Aaliyah," Megan continued, her voice cracking perfectly on cue. "My parents downsized their house last year. They do not have room for me and the kids. Please, you cannot kick me out today. The children need stability. They need their home. Their bedrooms are here. Their schools are right down the street. If you throw us out, you are punishing innocent children for the crimes of their father. Just let me stay in the house, just until the divorce is final and I can get on my feet. I promise I will pay you rent once I find a job." I stared at her, letting her tears flow without offering a single ounce of comfort. Attorney Davis stood silently beside me, holding his briefcase, watching the desperate negotiation unfold. "You are an incredible actress, Megan," I said, my voice flat and devoid of any sympathy. "If I did not know exactly who you were, I might actually feel sorry for you. You use your children as a shield, the exact same way my mother used me. You think because you are crying, I will suddenly forget that you stood in that dining room and called my natural hair unkempt. You think I will forget that you tried to force me to pay a $25,000 catering bill while you paraded around carrying a bag bought with my stolen money." Megan let out a soft, wounded gasp. "I was just upset, Aaliyah," she pleaded. "I was stressed and I took it out on you. I am so sorry. I am a good mother just trying to protect my babies. I have absolutely nothing left. Malik ruined my life and left me completely penniless." I smiled coldly. "Penniless," I repeated, tilting my head slightly. "That is a very interesting choice of words, Megan. Attorney Davis, would you care to enlighten my sister-in-law about her current definition of penniless?" Attorney Davis opened his folder again, pulling out a single sheet of paper. He held it out so Megan could see the complex banking logo printed at the top. "Ms. Megan," he began, his professional tone cutting right through her theatrical sobbing. "During our forensic audit of Ms. Aaliyah's stolen assets, we did not just track the federal loan disbursements. We tracked the secondary wire transfers. We traced the money you personally moved out of the fraudulent joint accounts you shared with your husband." Megan's tears stopped instantly. The fragile victim routine vanished from her face, replaced by a stark, terrifying realization. She stared at the piece of paper in Davis' hand, her breathing suddenly completely still. "It seems you were not quite the clueless victim of your husband's manipulation," Davis continued smoothly. "6 months ago, you opened a private offshore account in the Cayman Islands under your maiden name. You began systematically siphoning funds from the fraudulent Small Business Administration loans and hiding them in that offshore account. You were building a secret nest egg, Megan. A safety net funded entirely by stolen federal money. You managed to squirrel away nearly $150,000 before the accounts were flagged. Megan's jaw dropped. She looked like she had just been struck by lightning. She took a staggering step backward, shaking her head in silent denial. "You thought you were so much smarter than Malik," I said, stepping toward her. "You knew his house of cards was going to collapse eventually, so you started stealing from the thief. You planned to take that offshore money, divorce him and disappear, leaving him to take the fall for the federal fraud, while you lived comfortably on my stolen funds. You played the devoted wife while quietly robbing him blind." Megan tried to speak, but she was completely suffocated by her own exposure. The offshore account was her ultimate backup plan. It was the only reason she had been so quick to throw Malik under the bus to the federal authorities. She thought she had a secret fortune waiting for her in the Caribbean. "And just to be completely clear," Davis added, placing the paper back into his folder, "our legal team filed an emergency injunction with the international banking authorities late last night. The moment we provided proof that the funds in your Cayman account were the direct proceeds of federal loan fraud and identity theft, the offshore bank complied with the freeze order. That account is permanently locked, Megan. The federal government will be seizing those funds by the end of the week." Megan let out a low, agonizing sound that seemed to scrape against the back of her throat. Her knees buckled slightly and she had to lean against the wall to keep from collapsing onto the marble floor. There were no more white tears. There was no more weaponized fragility. There was only the absolute crushing weight of total defeat. She had nothing. Her husband was in handcuffs. Her house was gone. Her luxury cars were repossessed, and her secret stolen fortune had been confiscated by the federal government. She was completely and utterly ruined. "You have about 5 minutes left on that eviction notice, Megan," I said, checking my watch. "I suggest you stop crying and start packing. Your children are currently at your mother's house for the weekend brunch. I suggest you call her and tell her to make room." Megan did not argue. She did not try to plead or negotiate or hurl another racist insult. The fight was completely drained out of her. She looked at me with hollow, dead eyes, realizing that the ugly duckling sister-in-law she had tormented for years was the very person who had orchestrated her absolute destruction. She turned around and walked slowly toward the grand staircase. Her shoulders slumped, her expensive designer dress hanging off her like a discarded rag. She looked like a ghost haunting a house she no longer owned. I walked over to the open front door and stood on the porch, breathing in the warm spring air. Outside, the neighborhood was finally quiet. The tow trucks had disappeared down the street, taking the last remnants of my family's fake wealth with them. The sheriff cruiser carrying my brother pulled away from the curb, its red and blue lights fading into the distance as it headed toward the federal holding facility in downtown Atlanta. The long, sweeping driveway was completely empty now. The chaotic symphony of flashing lights, screaming relatives, and revving engines had faded into an absolute profound silence. I stood there on the threshold of the multi-million-dollar mansion that belonged solely to me, watching the dust settle. The fortress of abuse and manipulation had been conquered, and for the first time in 34 years, the air felt completely clean. I turned my back on the empty driveway and walked back into the grand foyer. The heavy oak doors shut behind me with a solid, reassuring thud. Upstairs, I could hear the frantic shuffling of footsteps and the scraping of cheap luggage wheels against the hardwood floors. Megan came down first. She was struggling to carry 2 large suitcases, her face red and blotchy. She did not look at me. She just dragged her bags out the door, leaving the house she had paraded around in like a queen. A few minutes later, my parents descended the grand staircase. Leroy was carrying a couple of duffel bags, his shoulders slumped, looking like a completely defeated man. Bernice followed him, clutching a small overnight bag to her chest. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked around the foyer one last time, her eyes tracing the crystal chandelier and the marble floors. She opened her mouth to speak, to hurl one last insult, or to beg for one last ounce of mercy, but she looked at my face, and the words died in her throat. She finally understood that I was a fortress she could no longer breach. They walked out the door and got into the cheap ride-share vehicle they had ordered to take them to the Starlight Inn. I watched the car roll down the driveway and out through the security gates. They were gone. I stood completely alone in the center of the massive estate. Attorney Davis was making phone calls in the den, giving me the space I needed to process the absolute silence of the house. I walked slowly through the ground floor, tracing my fingers along the expensive wainscoting and the custom silk wallpaper. I walked into the formal dining room where just an hour ago, my family had raised their glasses to toast my absence and mock my existence. The half-empty champagne flutes still sat on the long mahogany table, alongside plates of untouched, expensive caviar. The lingering smell of my mother's heavy floral perfume still hung in the air, but it was fading quickly, replaced by the clean, neutral scent of an empty property. I walked up the grand staircase, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. I walked past the master suite where Bernice and Leroy had slept, surrounded by luxury they had never earned. I walked past the guest rooms that Megan had tried to claim for her own children. Every room I entered felt like shedding another layer of my traumatic childhood. The haunting memories of manipulation, of being told I was not pretty enough or smart enough or light-skinned enough, simply began to evaporate. The ghosts of their emotional abuse could not survive in the bright sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The heavy, suffocating energy of their narcissism and their greed was completely flushed out of the building. I walked back downstairs and pulled out my phone. I did not just want them out of the house. I wanted every single trace of their miserable existence scrubbed from the property. I called a premium estate clearing service in downtown Atlanta and ordered their immediate emergency package. I told the dispatcher I needed a full crew at the property within the hour. I gave them very specific instructions. I told them to bring their largest commercial dumpsters and to throw away every single piece of furniture, every rug, every curtain, and every decoration my mother had ever purchased. I wanted the plush velvet sofas tossed into the garbage. I wanted the tacky, oversized portraits of Malik taken down and destroyed. I wanted the entire house stripped down to the bare studs and the polished marble. Within 45 minutes, a fleet of commercial vans pulled into the driveway. A crew of 20 workers swarmed the house wearing shoe covers and carrying heavy-duty trash bags. I stood in the foyer directing traffic, watching with absolute satisfaction as they dismantled my mother's carefully curated aesthetic piece by piece. They hauled out the heavy dining room table where my family had planned to steal my inheritance. They ripped down the silk curtains and rolled up the expensive Persian rugs. The physical manifestations of their fake wealth were tossed unceremoniously into the giant steel dumpsters in the driveway. While the cleaning crew purged the interior, I coordinated with a high-end security firm. A team of technicians arrived to immediately change every single lock on the property. They replaced the heavy brass deadbolts with advanced biometric scanners. They installed a state-of-the-art perimeter defense system complete with high-definition cameras, motion sensors, and a direct line to the local police department. The estate was no longer just a house. It was a highly secure fortress, and I was the only person with the access codes. The sun was beginning to set, casting long golden shadows across the empty driveway. The cleaning crews and the security technicians had finally finished their work and packed up their trucks, leaving the estate pristine and completely quiet. The house was entirely empty now, stripped of all the toxic baggage and ready to be transformed into something new. I walked back into the private den where the confrontation had originally started. Attorney Davis was sitting behind the bare mahogany desk, which was one of the only pieces of furniture I had allowed the crew to leave behind. He was organizing a stack of crisp legal documents, slipping them neatly into his leather briefcase. The federal fraud case, the eviction notices, the offshore account freezes, everything had been executed flawlessly. He looked up as I entered the room, his expression serious and entirely professional. He reached into his briefcase one last time and pulled out a single thick document bound with a blue legal cover. "Mrs. Aelia Davis," said his voice echoing slightly in the now empty room. "The property is fully secured, and the federal authorities have Malik in custody. The banks have confirmed the total freeze on all their remaining assets. Your financial portfolio is completely insulated from any further unauthorized access." He slid the thick document across the smooth surface of the mahogany desk, stopping it right in front of me. He uncapped a heavy silver fountain pen and laid it carefully beside the paper. "There is just one final piece of business we need to conclude today," Davis continued, looking me dead in the eye. "I had my legal team draft this up while the cleaning crews were working. It is the final layer of protection for your new life." I looked down at the document, reading the bold black letters printed across the top page. It was not a financial ledger or a property deed. It was a permanent comprehensive restraining order against Bernice, Leroy, Malik, and Megan. This legal injunction forbids them from ever contacting you, approaching your properties, or coming within 500 feet of your person. Davis explained, his tone carrying the absolute weight of the law. "If they attempt to reach out to you, if they attempt to manipulate you, or if they so much as send a single text message, they will be immediately arrested and jailed." I picked up the silver fountain pen, feeling its heavy, cool weight in my hand. I looked at the signature line, waiting for my authorization to completely and legally sever myself from my biological family forever. I pressed the nib of the heavy silver fountain pen against the thick parchment paper. The dark blue ink flowed smoothly, leaving a bold and deliberate signature across the bottom of the restraining order. It was the most liberating signature I had ever written in my entire life. I pushed the document back across the smooth mahogany desk toward Attorney Davis. He nodded silently, picking up the paper and sliding it into a protective clear folder before securing it inside his leather briefcase. The loud, satisfying click of the metal latches echoing in the empty den signaled the absolute end of an era. The legal wall was now fully constructed and reinforced. My biological relatives were officially and permanently locked out of my universe. There would be no more manipulative phone calls and no more surprise visits. The parasitic cord was finally severed. I walked out of the private den and stepped into the vast, open foyer. The silence of the massive estate was no longer heavy or suffocating like it had been when my mother ruled the halls. The air felt light and clean. The toxic residue of my childhood, the echoing demands of my parents, and the arrogant laughter of my brother had all been scrubbed away by the commercial cleaning crews and the absolute finality of my actions. I opened the heavy front doors and stepped out onto the wide stone porch. The evening air was cool and crisp against my skin. The sky above the affluent neighborhood was painted in deep shades of purple and orange as the sun slowly dipped below the tall manicured trees. A sleek black Maybach glided silently up the long, sweeping driveway. The dark-tinted windows reflected the vibrant sunset, and the polished chrome trim gleamed under the newly activated estate security lights. The luxurious vehicle came to a smooth, perfect stop right in front of the porch steps. A sharply dressed chauffeur stepped out and walked around to open the rear passenger door for me. I did not rush to leave. I stood on the porch for one last moment and looked back at the massive brick exterior of the mansion. For 34 years, this house, or whatever house my parents had occupied, had been a towering symbol of my own inadequacy. It had been a fortress of emotional abuse, a place where I was constantly reminded that my dark skin and my natural hair made me unworthy of their unconditional love. But looking at the structure now, the emotional weight was completely gone. It was no longer a childhood trauma trigger, or a monument to the narcissism of a mother who despised me. It was simply a piece of premium real estate. It was just another highly profitable asset in my massive investment portfolio. I would have my corporate management team list the property for a lucrative commercial lease the following Monday. I stepped off the porch, slid into the incredibly soft leather seat of the Maybach, and let the chauffeur close the heavy door. The car rolled smoothly out of the iron gates, and I did not look back, even once. 6 months passed rapidly. The wheels of federal justice grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. Malik's criminal trial was short and entirely devastating. The mountain of digital evidence, the forged Small Business Administration loan documents, and the blatant federal tax evasion left his appointed public defender with absolutely nothing to argue. Malik was convicted on all federal counts. The federal judge did not care about his golden child status, his lighter skin, or his charming smile. Those things held no currency in a federal courtroom. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison without any possibility of early parole. The arrogant man who had stolen my hard-earned money to buy fake luxury watches was now wearing a state-issued jumpsuit, earning mere cents an hour working in the prison laundry room. Megan did not fare much better in the aftermath. Her desperate tear-filled attempt to throw Malik under the bus and play the fragile suburban victim did not save her from the absolute financial ruin she helped create. The federal investigators permanently seized her secret offshore account in the Cayman Islands, leaving her with nothing. The Internal Revenue Service garnished her wages and placed heavy permanent liens on any future income she might ever earn. She was forced to declare complete and total bankruptcy. Her wealthy country club friends and elite social circle abandoned her the very moment her white Porsche was towed down the street. She had to move back into her parents' cramped basement with her children stripped of all the luxury and status she had sacrificed her basic human decency to maintain. She became a total pariah in her own community, working a minimum wage retail job just to survive. As for my parents, their descent into poverty was swift and absolute. The 7 days I paid for at the Starlight Inn ran out exactly as promised. With no savings, no credit, and their reputation utterly obliterated in the Atlanta high society scene. They had no choice but to rent a tiny run-down one-bedroom apartment in a dangerous neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The meager money Leroy managed to scrape together from a demanding physical labor job at a local warehouse barely covered their monthly rent and their cheap groceries. The cramped, peeling walls of their tiny apartment became a daily pressure cooker for their highly toxic marriage. They spent every single day bitterly blaming each other for their spectacular downfall. Bernice blamed Leroy for being weak and not protecting the family wealth, while Leroy blamed Bernice for her insatiable greed and her obsessive need to coddle their criminal son. They lived in a perpetual state of misery, trapped in a miserable prison of their own making, with no one left to manipulate and no one left to exploit. While they rotted away in the dark consequences of their own actions, my life expanded in beautiful ways I had only ever dreamed of. I was standing on the expansive glass balcony of my multi-million-dollar penthouse in downtown Chicago. The icy evening wind coming off Lake Michigan felt incredibly refreshing against my skin. The brilliant city lights glittered far below me, a sprawling ocean of opportunity and unmatched power. My investment firm had just closed another record-breaking quarter, and my personal wealth had grown exponentially. I held a delicate crystal glass of expensive vintage wine, feeling the smooth stem between my fingers. The silence in my penthouse was not lonely or isolating. It was the sound of absolute peace. It was the beautiful sound of a life entirely free from emotional abuse, financial manipulation, and conditional love. I took a slow, deep sip of the rich red wine, letting the complex flavors settle on my tongue. I looked out over the glowing city skyline and thought about that Mother's Day brunch 6 months ago. I thought about the cruel laughter echoing through the open dining room window of that suburban mansion. I thought about the crystal glasses clinking together as they mocked my clothes, my hair, and my inherent worth. They raised their glasses and happily toasted to my absence. I smiled, taking one last look at the beautiful, glittering city spread out below me. They toasted to my absence, so I made it permanent. The most profound lesson here is that sharing DNA does not give anyone the right to exploit or disrespect you. True family is built on unconditional love and mutual respect, not toxic entitlement. Society often weaponizes family loyalty to force victims into enduring narcissistic abuse. However, protecting your inner peace and setting ironclad boundaries is the ultimate act of self-love. You never owe your success to those who prayed for your downfall. Sometimes the most empowering decision you can make is to cut the toxic cord, walk away, and build a thriving life entirely on your own terms. Have you ever had to set hard boundaries or cut ties with a toxic family member to protect your peace? Share your empowering story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more inspiring content.